If there's one thing that the Catholic Church has an abundance of, it's rules. Whether it's the economy or family, the environment or liturgy, you can be assured that the Church has thought about it and offered both a theological stance and practical directives. If it relates in any way to our salvation in the kingdom of God, we're going to have something to say about it. This is not to say, however, that everyone necessarily agrees on these rules. Even within the Church, there are those who disagree, even disobey what the Church teaches. Which brings up some interesting questions. Can a Catholic faithfully disagree with the Church and remain in communion? And if so, where do we draw the line? This is Catholicism in Focus. While there may be many rules and stances in the Catholic Church, it's also true that not all of our teachings are created equal. The centrality and authoritative status of church teachings differ greatly. Believing that Jesus is the Son of God is kind of more important than a rule to fast on Fridays. While all of the teachings of the Church are important to some extent and play a role in our lives on the way to salvation, they do not all bear the same weight, hold the same authority, or demand the same level of obedience. For this reason, the Church speaks of what is called the hierarchy of truths. First officially coined in the Decree on Ecumenism at Vatican II, is a concept that has existed in the Church's practice for centuries. The idea is not to suggest that certain teachings are essential while others are optional, but rather to differentiate between those teachings that constitute the object of faith, say the definition of the Trinity, and those that lead to the way of salvation, say specific formulations of transubstantiation. Unfortunately, there is no section in the Catechism specifically naming the categories or listing the order of such a hierarchy. Vatican II defined the concept, but probably wisely didn't fill in all of the details. That said, theologians like Richard Guyard-Detz have produced helpful guides, such as his book By What Authority, that provide important questions we can ask in evaluating each teaching. What is the source of the teaching? Something from Scripture is far more authoritative than, say, a private revelation or theological reflection on current events. What is the authoritative status of the document suggesting the teaching? Dogmatic constitutions bear far more weight than encyclicals or apostolic exhortations. In what form is the teaching being proposed? Sometimes a teaching uses dogmatic language like "we solemnly declare," while others use more casual language such as "it is fitting." What's the historical context of the document? In other words, is it attempting to respond to a specific issue for a specific people in a specific time? Or is it meant more universally? And finally, how frequently has this teaching been invoked? Something that has appeared in dozens of official documents is more authoritative than a teaching proposed once in 2,000 years. It's in evaluating these questions that theologians like Guyard-Detz suggest that the theological teachings of the Church can be broken down into 4 main categories of authority, each with a different appropriate response expected of believers. At the top are dogmas, the highest level of teaching, divinely revealed statements of faith that communicate God's saving message of salvation. These teachings come directly from Scripture and deal with the most essential aspects of our faith, things like the divinity of Christ, resurrection of the body, and a belief in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Because of the centrality of these teachings, they are taught to be irreformable, meaning that they will never change and require an assent of faith. If you can't believe a dogmatic statement of the Church, you really can't call yourself a member of the Church. This is heresy. Beneath these teachings are what are called definitive doctrines, explanations of dogmatic statements that are necessary for safeguarding and expounding divine revelation. An example of this sort of teaching would be the determination of the books in the Bible. While not explicitly defined in Scripture or direct revelation, the Church holds that these sorts of teachings are irreformable as well, although the believer's response is not quite as serious. Instead of a full assent of faith, the faithful must show firm acceptance of these doctrines, accepting and holding them to be true. What does that mean practically? Well, publicly denouncing these teachings would definitely cause some serious problems, but there seems to be no evidence in the modern Church of considering denials of this sort as heresy, and withholding private assent to these teachings would not necessarily remove one from the Church. Although I don't recommend it. Next down the ladder is what is called authoritative doctrine, teachings offered as a reflection on Scripture and tradition in light of contemporary issues, often in the form of concrete moral imperatives. Examples would include the prohibition against targeting civilians in an act of war, or the use of in vitro fertilization as a means of conception. Because these teachings are not directly from Scripture or tradition itself, and rely heavily on a particular historical context, these teachings are not irreformable. Rather, the Church acknowledges the possibility of error or even need of change in these teachings, as seen in things like the original acceptance of slavery or condemnation of usury. For this reason, what is required of the believer in these teachings is not an assent of faith or firm acceptance, but rather a religious docility of will and intellect. What? Again, a term proposed by Vatican II, its practical definition is often disputed, but what it comes down to is this. You've got to make a genuine effort to accept it. Guyardet suggests that this necessarily involves three things: a critical study of the teaching to dispel misconceptions, an examination of conscience to ensure that it isn't being rejected simply because it would require a conversion of heart, and an evaluation of one's approach to authority in general, because maybe it's not the teaching we reject, but the very idea that the magisterium can authentically teach at all. Thus, as is the case with definitive doctrine, failure to assent to authoritative doctrine does not necessarily remove one from the Church. And finally, we have the lowest rung of Church teaching: pastoral applications of Church doctrine, Church discipline, and prudential admonitions. Often presented as applications of the faith, these teachings are the most dependent on circumstance and thus are prone to change, making them neither irreformable nor authoritative. Examples of these teachings include clerical celibacy, rules for fasting, and particular economic policies that might not be fitting for all times and places. Given the lack of constancy or authority of these teachings, all that is required of the believer in this area is what is called conscientious obedience, the insistence that believers trust the teaching authority of the Church unless it would lead them to sin. Put another way, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops wrote that such teachings must be given serious attention and consideration by Catholics as they determine whether their moral judgments are consistent with the gospel. If the Church is teaching it, you can't ignore it. Take it seriously and follow your shepherd. Which is kind of the point of it all. If this thing we call church is going to work, there must be an underlying sense of trust in everything we do. It is not enough to look merely at the penalties incurred and shoot for the bare minimum to remain in the Church. Although one could, technically, disagree with every single authoritative doctrine and Church discipline without being thrown out of the Church, that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be other consequences. Any failure of assent, or worse, any active dissent and disobedience, is disruptive to a community. Simply getting thrown out can't be our goal. Think of it in more of a relational sense. Dogmas are sort of your ultimatums. If you do this, we can't be friends anymore. They're ironclad, non-negotiable, things that you just don't mess with. Don't steal my stuff. Don't cheat on me. Don't set my house on fire. Now, not everything in a relationship is necessarily phrased as an ultimatum, in itself catastrophic to the friendship, but that doesn't mean that everything else can simply be disobeyed. The simple requests, the smaller things, still matter. You can't just go, well, I made a mess of your house, talked about you behind your back, forgot your birthday, and borrowed your car without asking, but at least I didn't set your house on fire. Still friends? Probably not. The same goes for the Church. Just because the big things are the only ones with drastic penalties doesn't mean that nothing else matters. If we truly believe that the Church is the authentic teaching authority of Christ on earth, and I mean really believe that, then we owe it to ourselves, to the community of believers, to Christ himself, to take the Church's teachings seriously. We may find certain aspects extremely challenging. We may struggle to fully assent to them, but that does not give us license to outright deny them. Ask questions, challenge where necessary, but also go out of your way to trust that Christ might just be at work in the Church.